The HOA said they were drilling for oil to boost property value. I told them the ground would swallow their homes before it ever made them rich. They said Tennessee quiet had a way of healing people, but when I came back, silence felt more like a wound than a comfort. After 21 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, I thought I'd finally earned peace. Just me, the land, and the ghosts that came with both. My father's ranch sat on 160 acres of ridge country, the kind of place where mornings smelled like hay and river silt, and the horizon never ended. I'd spent half my life building roads and fortifications in places where the earth hated us, where it trembled from artillery and shook with fear. Out here, the only tremors were from the hooves of my horses. I thought that meant safety. I was wrong. The day I came home for good, the wind moved through the barn slats like breath through a harmonica, low, tired, and familiar. Dust shimmered in the sunlight that cut through the broken window pane. My father's old saddle still hung by the door, cracked leather but sturdy as ever. I brushed my hand across it, feeling the grooves worn into the horn from decades of use. It was the kind of thing you don't just see, you feel. This land had raised me before the Army ever claimed me, and every rock, every fence post felt like part of a language I used to speak. Coming back was supposed to be a return to that language. I'd planned it all simple. Fix the barn, mend the southern fence line, sell a few horses, and maybe start teaching riding lessons for the local kids. Peace wasn't supposed to be complicated, but the county had changed while I was gone. What used to be a dirt road leading to nothing but fields now split into cul-de-sacs with names like Silver Glen Estates and Whispering Pines. Vinyl siding glinted in the sun where wheat once grew. The old cattle path that used to cut through our property line was now a paved street lined with pastel mailboxes. Progress, they called it. The first time I met the new neighbors, they waved politely. Young couples, retirees, the kind of people who complained about barn smells but paid good money to live near the countryside. I kept my distance, figuring we could coexist. But coexistence isn't something people like that understand. Within a week, an envelope appeared in my mailbox sealed with an embossed gold emblem that looked more like a wedding invitation than official business. Silver Glen Homeowners Association. Notice of non-compliance. I remember standing on the porch with the letter in my hand, laughing under my breath. My barn, according to the notice, was in violation of community aesthetic standards. They suggested I repaint it to match the neutral tones of surrounding structures. The barn was built in 1946, long before Silver Glen existed. My father mixed that red paint himself in a rusted drum, swearing it would outlast the house. And it nearly had. That barn had survived storms, termites, even a lightning strike in '89. But apparently, it couldn't survive a neighborhood that wanted to turn everything beige. I figured it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they didn't know I wasn't part of their HOA. So, I wrote a polite note back, short, professional, explaining that my land had never been annexed into the Silver Glen development. I slid it into their community drop box and went back to sanding the barn doors. For a few days, I thought that would be the end of it. Then Connie showed up, clipboard in hand, smile too wide, perfume too sweet for a weekday morning. She was the kind of woman who wore her authority like jewelry, bright, visible, and meant to be noticed. "Good morning," she chirped, standing just inside my gate as if she already owned the place. "I'm Connie Miller, HOA secretary for Silver Glen. We just wanted to make sure you received our compliance notice." I told her I had, and that it didn't apply to me. Her smile faltered for half a second before snapping back like elastic. "Well, technically, you're adjacent to our community, and that does fall under our extended appearance clause." She said it like she was reciting scripture. I let her talk, but the longer she spoke, the clearer it became. She wasn't there to inform me. She was there to warn me. That was my first glimpse into how people like her worked. Smiles up front, claws underneath. I didn't argue. I'd had enough confrontations for a lifetime. Instead, I just said, "This barn's been standing here since before your HOA was even a thought. It's not changing. Something in her expression twitched, something small but sharp. I'll let the board know, she said, scribbling something on her clipboard before turning back toward the paved road. For a while, I convinced myself it was over. The days went back to being slow, steady, the kind of quiet you could hear your heartbeat in. I spent my mornings fixing fence posts and my afternoons brushing down the horses, Rusty, my Appaloosa, and Junebug, the young mare my father always said was too smart for her own good. At dusk the light turned the ridge gold, and I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the wind move through the grass. It was during one of those evenings that I noticed the first sign. A tremor, not loud, but deep. Like a pulse under the soil. The horses felt it before I did. Their ears flicked toward the southern ridge, restless. I set my coffee down and listened. The air was still, no thunder, no approaching storm, but the vibration came again. Low, mechanical, and wrong. I stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the gravel. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the pasture that I saw it. A thin trail of dust rising over the ridge, the kind that comes from heavy machinery. My heart sank, and an old instinct flared, the same one that had kept me alive overseas. You can tell the difference between harmless noise and something dangerous. This was the latter. I climbed onto the fence rail and scanned the horizon. Beyond the tree line, past where my property ended and the HOA's development began, I caught the flash of something metallic. Then the sound hit, metal grinding into rock, the deep, rhythmic whine of industrial drills. It didn't belong here. Not this close to the ridge, not this deep into limestone country. For a long moment, I just stood there, gripping the fence, feeling the vibration run through the wood and into my bones. I didn't know what they were doing yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever they'd started, it wasn't going to end quietly. The air that night was too still, too heavy, like the world had stopped to listen. Even the crickets were silent. And somewhere beyond that tree line, the ground was already stirring, preparing to speak. She hears the steady drone of drilling growing louder, breaking the morning silence. By the next morning, the sound wasn't distant anymore. It was in my bones. The low grind of machinery carried through the soil like a heartbeat, steady and wrong. I saddled Rusty before sunrise, rode south across the pasture, and crested the ridge where my father used to say the world divided between ours and theirs. What I saw on the other side made my stomach twist. 3 rigs, real industrial units, not some contractor's equipment, were planted in neat formation less than 50 yards past my fence. Workers in reflective vests moved like ants, dragging cables, hammering stakes, shouting orders. A black SUV idled nearby, door open, radio playing faint country music. I could smell diesel and wet clay. The rigs churned through rock like they were drilling into bone. I stopped Rusty at the fence and shouted, "Who authorized this?" One of the workers turned, confused, then pointed toward a man in a navy blazer and aviator sunglasses standing beside the SUV. He looked like a real estate brochure brought to life. Tan, polished, expensive. When he saw me approaching, he smiled as if I were a guest at his barbecue. "Morning," he called. "Rick Granger, president of the Silver Glen Homeowners Association." He said it like it was a title worth saluting. "Don't worry, ma'am, everything's perfectly legal. Just an exploratory drilling operation. We suspect there might be oil or natural gas pockets beneath the ridge. Could be a real boost for community property values." I slid off Rusty, boots sinking into damp earth. "That's community land," I said. "This side of the fence isn't. You're 20 yards from my property line." He adjusted his sunglasses, eyes unreadable. "We're aware of the boundaries, Ms. Brooks. The equipment's positioned well within HOA limits. Nothing to worry about." I looked at the rigs again. 3 of them, drilling straight into a shelf of limestone I'd studied since childhood. My father had warned me that ridge was hollow beneath, carved by old water tunnels and air pockets. You could feel it in the way the ground gave slightly when it rained too much. One wrong vibration, and the entire shelf could fold in on itself. "You're boring into unstable karst," I said flatly. That rock wasn't meant to hold your kind of machinery. Rick's smile widened. Our engineers have cleared it. Certified professionals. We've got all the right permits. I've seen certified professionals build bridges that still collapsed. I told him, you're not just risking your development, you're risking mine. He sighed as if humoring a child. Ms. Brooks, I understand this is unsettling for you, but progress sometimes comes with growing pains. You're welcome to attend our next HOA meeting if you'd like to express your concerns. I'm not part of your HOA. He gave a small shrug. That's unfortunate. We could have really used your cooperation. That word, cooperation, wasn't an offer. It was a warning. I'd heard that tone before. Overseas, from men who smiled when they meant stand down. I stepped closer until I could see my reflection in his sunglasses. Let me make something clear. You can't enforce HOA rules beyond your boundary. If I never signed your covenant, your jurisdiction ends at my fence line. He tilted his head, considering me like I was a puzzle he didn't plan to solve. Technically true, he said softly, but influence doesn't stop at the fence. Communities work best when everyone plays along. I stared at the rigs. One of them screeched as it hit something hard. The ground shuddered just slightly under my boots. The men kept working, oblivious. Rick noticed the vibration too, but didn't flinch. We're done here, Ms. Brooks, he said finally. Enjoy your morning. He turned away, already talking into his phone. His voice carried, calm, confident, in control. Behind him, Connie appeared, clipboard at the ready, scribbling notes like a court stenographer. I recognized that smug efficiency. People like her didn't document progress. They documented cover. Rusty pawed the ground, uneasy. The vibration grew for a few seconds, then faded into a low hum. I rested a hand on the fence, the same fence my father and I had built decades ago, and felt the tremor pass through it like a shiver. Rick's SUV door slammed. The engine growled to life, and the convoy of rigs kept drilling. As he pulled away, he waved once, the gesture small and mocking. Have a blessed day, Ms. Brooks, he called out. I watched him go, my jaw tight, heart steady. I'd seen arrogance before, but never this close to home. The earth beneath us wasn't just soil. It was memory, and it didn't forgive greed easily. I whispered to the ridge, not to him, not even to myself, but to the ground that had raised me. That ground won't forgive you, I said. Rick just smiled. The drilling deepens. The vibration lingers, and Sarah senses the land beginning to stir. When you've spent years building in war zones, you learn to read the ground like a pulse. Every vibration means something. The night after my standoff with Rick Granger, I couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, still. Even the crickets seemed uneasy. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the drills whined again, low and constant, like a machine exhaling. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound wasn't loud, but it traveled through the house in thin metallic whispers, rattling the picture frames just enough to make the glass tick. By morning, I decided if they wanted to treat this like a war of patience, I'd fight it like one. Quietly, strategically, I pulled my old military case from the barn loft, the one marked field monitoring equipment. Inside were tools I hadn't touched in years, vibration sensors, seismic gauges, and a compact data logger. Gear built for construction in unstable terrain, but now it would serve a different purpose. The first sensor I buried near the southern fence line, just 6 inches under the topsoil, where I could record every tremor coming through the limestone shelf. I placed another closer to the barn, calibrated to pick up shifts in ground resonance. It wasn't fancy, it was survival engineering. For good measure, I mounted 2 wildlife cameras on the oak trees that lined the ridge, one infrared, one motion triggered. Every time the rigs fired up, I wanted proof. Sound, footage, vibration data, timestamps. Some people fight back with anger. I've learned the power of evidence. A homeowner has the legal right to document any environmental changes that affect their property. Air, water, soil, or structural stability. They call it reasonable monitoring under self-interest. In the Army, we called it situational awareness. By the end of the first day, the rigs had settled into a steady rhythm. I logged the vibration intervals by the hour, noting the difference in frequency between morning and evening drills. By nightfall, the numbers were clear. The tremors were intensifying, not fading. The ground was taking each strike a little deeper, like something softening under pressure. The horses felt it before I did. Rusty wouldn't drink from the southern trough. He'd stare toward the ridge, ears pinned, muscles twitching under his coat. Junebug started pacing her stall at sundown, head tossing like she was trying to shake the sound out of her skull. Animals sense instability before humans admit it exists. 2 nights later, I stood by the fence with a flashlight, scanning the ridge. The horizon glowed faintly orange from floodlights the drilling crews had set up. I could see silhouettes moving, men working through the night, laughter carrying on the wind. The sound of it scraped at something deep in me. They were laughing on hollow ground. At midnight, I checked the first sensor's data stream. The readings had spiked twice that evening, sharp, vertical jolts, unlike any pattern I'd seen before. I double-checked the calibration, but the readings were right. The ground wasn't just vibrating, it was shifting. Around 1:30 a.m., I walked the southern pasture again. The soil under my boots felt wrong, looser, almost breathing. I knelt and pressed my palm against the earth. It wasn't imagination. There was a faint pulse, a rhythmic quiver, like water moving far below. I thought of the maps my father had drawn of the old ridge caves, pockets of underground voids carved by forgotten streams. They'd warned of those tunnels, even in his day. That's why we never let the cattle graze too close to that slope. When the first metallic crack echoed across the ridge, I froze. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of rock under tension. Then came the deep rumble that rolled through the pasture, slow and deliberate, until it reached the barn. Rusty neighed loud enough to wake the dead, kicking his stall boards until splinters flew. I ran to calm him, but the vibration came again. Longer this time, lower, resonant. The clock on the wall read 2:03 a.m. when the seismic monitor peaked off the chart. I grabbed my logbook, marked the time, and stared at the numbers flashing on the screen. The frequency was too deep for human machinery, too steady for trucks or drills. It felt alive. The earth had always been patient, but patience, like bedrock, has a breaking point. At exactly 2:03 a.m., Sarah's instruments record the deepest tremor yet, one that doesn't fade but echoes, as if something beneath the ridge just woke up. The next morning, I packed my evidence like a soldier preparing for inspection. Soil readings, seismic data logs, camera footage, all printed, labeled, and sealed in a folder marked Structural Instability. Silver Glen Ridge. I'd seen enough numbers to know what they meant. The land was shifting beneath the HOA's new rigs, and if they didn't stop drilling, it wasn't just a matter of damage. It was a matter of collapse. I drove straight to the county development office downtown, a squat building that smelled like coffee and copier ink. The woman at the front desk looked up with the same glazed politeness I'd seen in bureaucracies across continents. "Application or complaint?" she asked. "Evidence," I said, setting the folder down. "You'll want to see this." Her name tag read Jill, and she hesitated before motioning toward a door marked Environmental Review. 10 minutes later, I found myself sitting across from Councilwoman Dana Holloway. The name stirred a memory. She'd been in the local news, a young, reform-minded politician with a reputation for being straightforward in a county full of backroom deals. She was dressed sharp, but there were dark circles under her eyes, the kind you earn from arguing too long with people who stop listening. She flipped through my pages, her brow tightening as she read. "These are your readings?" "Yes, ma'am." "Seismic fluctuations over a 3-day period. The HOA's rigs are boring into a karst ridge, unstable limestone. There are voids beneath that formation large enough to swallow a house." She looked up. "And you're sure?" "I spent 2 decades building on terrain like this. You hit it wrong, it caves. Dana sighed, tapping her pen against the table. The Silver Glen HOA filed their project under a community improvement exemption. That allows small-scale exploratory work without full geological review. They claim they're testing soil integrity for irrigation upgrades. I felt heat rise behind my ribs. Irrigation doesn't require 40-ton drill rigs. I agree, she said quietly. But unless we can prove they're conducting extractive operations, oil, gas, minerals, we can't stop them under the exemption. There it was, the loophole. I'd seen that clause used overseas to justify half-built bases on floodplains. The language was always the same: temporary improvement, exploratory exemption. It was legal camouflage. I can give you copies of my footage, I said, leaning forward. The rigs are Ridgecore Energy models, industrial grade. You show that to anyone with a pulse, and they'll tell you this isn't irrigation. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Send it to me. I'll push for a review, but her voice lowered. You should know, the HOA's president, Rick Granger, has friends on the zoning board, and Ridgecore's owner donated to the last election campaign. This won't be easy. I met her eyes. I didn't come for easy. I came to stop a collapse. She smiled faintly, tired but sincere. I'll do what I can, Ms. Brooks. When I left the office, the sun was already high, but the air felt colder somehow. Bureaucracy moved like mud, slow, thick, and never in the direction you needed. Still, I held on to that small thread of hope that maybe Dana's name carried enough weight to slow them down. That hope lasted 2 days. On Friday afternoon, I received an email from the county office, a formal notice stating that the HOA's operations were in compliance with temporary zoning exemptions and that no immediate geological threat has been verified. The wording was sterile, mechanical, and devastating. I stared at it until the screen blurred. By sunset, the rigs were louder than ever. I rode Rusty to the ridge again, and there they were. 3 towers of steel silhouetted against the fading light, roaring like engines of denial. A group of HOA board members stood watching from the cul-de-sac, holding coffee cups, chatting, even laughing. Connie's shrill voice carried across the field. That Brooks woman's still at it. Thinks she's a scientist now. The laughter cut through the hum of the drills. I felt it in my spine. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was ignorance, dressed as pride. They didn't understand that the earth doesn't care about paperwork or politics. As the last of the light drained from the sky, I turned back toward the fence. That's when I saw it, just a few feet from the southern post, a jagged seam running through the grass. No wider than my thumb, but deep enough that the flashlight couldn't find the bottom. I crouched down and brushed the dirt away. The edges crumbled inward, slow, deliberate, like the ground was exhaling. I didn't need my instruments to tell me what it meant. The ridge had started to move. Sarah watches the crack widen under her hand, realizing the earth itself has begun to warn them, and no one's listening. The first notice showed up on a Monday morning, duct taped to my gate like a ransom letter. The paper bore the Silver Glen HOA letterhead. Gold seal, bold font, that same smug authority that dripped from every word they wrote. I peeled it off and read it once, twice, then laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Violation. Unauthorized soil disruption. Apparently, the flag markers I'd placed to identify shifting ground now counted as unapproved landscaping modifications. According to the notice, I had 7 days to restore all disturbed areas to approved neighborhood condition. The letter ended with a warning: non-compliance would result in a $500 fine. They couldn't fine me. Legally, an HOA's power ends at the property lines of those who signed its covenant. My land was never annexed, never deeded, never under their control, but that didn't stop them. Harassment doesn't need truth, it just needs persistence. By Wednesday, there were 2 more envelopes: improper fencing alteration and public disturbance through unwarranted complaints. That last one nearly made me tear the paper in half. They were referring to my soil reports and my warnings to the county. They were turning my evidence into a weapon. I kept every notice, hole punched and filed neatly in a binder. If they wanted a paper war, I'd fight on their battlefield. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about intimidation. 2 days later, I spotted Connie Miller's silver SUV pulling into my driveway. She stepped out in pressed slacks and a powder blue blouse, clipboard tucked under one arm, her hair perfectly sprayed into place despite the heat. The kind of person who looked allergic to dirt. "Morning, Sarah," she said brightly, as if she hadn't just accused me of disrupting soil on my own land. I crossed my arms. "If you're here to deliver another violation, you can leave it on the gate." "Oh no," she said, feigning innocence. "I just thought we could clear the air. The board doesn't want any bad blood. We're all part of the same community, after all." I almost laughed. "I'm not part of your community, Connie. You've reminded me plenty." Her smile flickered. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. You see, technically, your property borders association land, which means you benefit from certain shared services. Road maintenance, drainage oversight, neighborhood security. The board feels it's only fair that you comply with the same guidelines as the rest of Silver Glen." I stepped closer. "So now you're saying because my road connects to yours, I owe you obedience." Her voice softened, falsely sweet. "You don't have to see it that way. Think of it as cooperation. There's even talk of compensation for landowners who agree to participate in the Ridgecore project. It could be profitable for you, Sarah. You just have to sign the participation agreement." There it was, the real reason she was here. They wanted me under their jurisdiction, retroactively. Once I signed, they could control my silence, twist my name, and make me liable for whatever disaster they were brewing under the ridge. "And if I don't?" I asked. Her eyes hardened just a fraction. "Then I can't guarantee the board won't escalate enforcement. We'd hate to involve legal counsel over something as simple as a misunderstanding." I could hear the threat buried beneath the syrup. I'd heard that tone overseas, from men with power they didn't deserve. My jaw tightened. "Let me make this clear for you, Connie. Your HOA can't fine me, can't cite me, and sure as hell can't threaten me. You don't have authority past that fence. Every dollar of these fake fines is illegal harassment, and I've documented everyone." She blinked, startled that I'd called it out so directly. "Sarah, no one's threatening you. You already have. 3 times in writing." Her posture straightened. "The board is simply trying to maintain order. We all want what's best for Silver Glen." I took a step forward, closing the distance until her perfume mixed with the scent of clay and hay. "If you really cared about Silver Glen," I said, my voice low, "you'd stop that drilling before the ground eats your neighborhood whole." She froze. "The readings are there," I continued. "The soil's shifting. There's a void under that ridge the size of a school bus, and your precious rigs are punching right into it. You can send me all the letters you want, but nature doesn't answer to paper." Connie's face drained of color, but her tone stayed clipped. "I'll pass your concerns to the board," she said, retreating toward her SUV. I watched her heels sink slightly into the soft earth as she walked. Even the ground was giving her a warning. Before she climbed into the driver's seat, I called out one last time. "Connie." She paused, hand on the door. "If that ground caves," I said, voice steady, "it'll take your homes with it." She didn't answer. She just shut the door, hard, and drove off, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air long after she was gone. For the first time, I realized the silence around me wasn't peace anymore. It was pressure. Something building beneath the surface, waiting to break. As Connie's SUV disappears over the hill, a faint tremor ripples under Sarah's boots. The land shifting again, closer, stronger, angrier. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't fight this alone. The ground was breathing, rising, falling, trembling under the weight of ignorance, and I needed someone who could translate what it was trying to say. That's when I called Dr. Everett Toller. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 8 years. Back when we worked together under FEMA contracts, Everett was the man you called when the earth stopped behaving. Grizzled, sarcastic, and half-deaf from decades of fieldwork, he could look at a rock core and tell you the story of 1,000 years in one glance. He'd saved my unit once in Afghanistan, warning that a construction zone we were building over was sitting on hollow limestone. We relocated the next day. 2 weeks later, the entire ridge collapsed into a sinkhole the size of a football field. Everett didn't believe in luck, only data. He answered my call on the second ring. "Brooks? Haven't heard that name in forever." "It's Sarah now," I said, "and I've got a problem under my pasture." When he arrived 3 days later, he pulled up in an old Ford covered in red dust, his back seat loaded with drills, augers, and coffee cups that looked as ancient as his field maps. He didn't waste time on greetings, just looked at the ridge and muttered, "You weren't kidding." We spent the next 50 hours combing through the southern field. Everett moved methodically, setting down markers every 20 feet, drilling core samples, measuring stress lines. Each time the rigs on the HOA side powered up, he'd glance at his seismometer and frown deeper. The machine's needle would spike, tremble, and settle again, like a pulse under strain. "See that?" he said, kneeling beside the monitor. "The ground's flexing. That's not supposed to happen. Means there's air somewhere below. An empty chamber." He handed me a core sample, gray-white limestone with hairline fractures spidering through it. "Those cracks are stress fractures. The vibration's traveling through a void. My guess? You've got a karst cavity underneath this ridge. Probably an old water tunnel. Big one." "How big?" I asked. Everett squinted at his readings. 80 yards long, maybe 40 wide. If Ridgecore's rigs punch through the ceiling, the pressure will build until the surface gives way. I looked toward the HOA's land, where the drills stood like metallic wasps, still digging. My stomach turned. "You're saying they're drilling straight into a hollow?" He nodded grimly. "They're essentially standing on an eggshell. Keep drilling and the whole thing collapses." We walked the ridge in silence. The air smelled of clay and ozone, sharp with tension. Every few steps, Everett stopped to measure micro-shifts in elevation. By evening, the sun hung low, casting long shadows over the cracked ground. He laid his maps across my tailgate, topographical overlays, seismic graphs, and cross-sections drawn by hand in his neat, deliberate script. The data didn't lie. The limestone shelf dipped sharply beneath the HOA's rigs before widening into a dark chamber on the scan, a hollow space that stretched directly under their cul-de-sac. It wasn't just a geological hazard, it was a trap waiting to open. "Can we stop them?" I asked. "Legally? Maybe," Everett said. Tennessee law allows for emergency injunctions when an excavation poses an immediate risk to life or property. You submit this data to the state geological office, they'll have 72 hours to respond. If they agree, they'll shut the whole operation down. And if they don't? He stared at the ridge for a long time before answering. Then nature will do it for them. That night, we set up a temporary camp near the fence line. The rigs hummed through the darkness, their spotlights carving beams into the sky. Everett sat beside the monitor, sipping burnt coffee, while I flipped through my notes by flashlight. The numbers all told the same story: pressure building, cracks widening, frequency deepening. Around midnight, the ground quivered again, stronger this time. The coffee rippled in Everett's mug. He leaned forward, watching the seismograph jump. "It's deep," he muttered. "That's the hollow shifting. It's not stable anymore." I felt it, too, the low, slow thrum, like the ridge itself was warning us. Everett stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "Get your horses north of the barn," he said, "and stay away from that fence line. If this collapses, it won't stop at your property." I stared at him, but his eyes were fixed on the glowing monitor, the line still shaking like a heartbeat that refused to steady. Everett's final words hang in the night air. "If it collapses, it won't stop at the fence." The ridge trembles once more, just enough to make the ground whisper beneath their boots. It happened at exactly 2:07 a.m. I remember because I'd just finished checking Everett's latest readings before heading to bed. The night was too still, no wind, no crickets, not even the low hum from the rigs. For the first time in weeks, the ridge was quiet. Unnaturally so. That silence stretched too long, the kind that makes your pulse quicken before you even know why. Then came the groan. Deep, ancient, and alive. The floorboards shuddered under my feet. Dishes rattled in the cabinets. Outside, Rusty screamed from the paddock, his voice slicing through the dark like a siren. I threw on my boots and ran for the door. The ground trembled again, harder this time, and the air filled with a sound I'll never forget. The tortured cracking of stone, echoing from somewhere deep beneath the ridge. When I reached the pasture, the sky was glowing orange from floodlights still running on the HOA rigs. Then suddenly, one of those lights flickered, tilted, and vanished, swallowed whole. The earth along the ridgeline split open with a thunderous roar, louder than any explosion I'd ever heard. The ridge didn't crumble, it imploded. The ground collapsed inward like a throat swallowing air, taking everything with it. The rigs went first, metal shrieking as they slid into the widening pit. Then came the houses perched closest to the edge. $1 million homes folding into themselves, wood snapping like toothpicks, alarms wailing before being silenced in an instant. The air filled with choking dust. I dropped to one knee, pulling my shirt over my mouth as grit stung my eyes. The smell was a mix of diesel, earth, and something metallic, raw and bitter. Behind me, the horses kicked at their stalls, wild-eyed and trembling. Every instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't. I had to see it. From the top of the fence I watched as the southern ridge, the land my father once called unbreakable, disappeared into itself. The roar lasted less than a minute, but it felt endless. When it stopped, the night went dead silent again. And then came the screams. HOA residents flooded out of their homes, some barefoot, others clutching children or phones, all covered in gray dust. Headlights flickered on one by one, slicing through the haze. People shouted names, disbelief turning to panic as they saw what was left of their perfect street, half of it gone, swallowed by a black crater that still smoked. Rick Granger stumbled out of his front door, shirtless, face pale under the dust. He looked around like a man searching for something to blame. When his eyes found me through the chaos, they hardened. He pointed across the field, voice breaking from fury. "This is your fault," he shouted. "You did this, you—" He couldn't even finish. His words cracked under the sound of sirens approaching from the highway. I stood by the fence, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't answer him. There was nothing to say. The ground had spoken louder than either of us ever could. Everett appeared beside me, covered in dirt, his expression grim. "It's gone," he said simply. The whole chamber collapsed from vibration. They drilled straight into the void. Down in the pit, one of the rigs still burned, a flicker of flame licking at the edge of the crater. The light cast shadows on the fractured limestone walls, layers of rock that had held for centuries until greed broke them open. By dawn, emergency vehicles lined the ridge, their red and blue lights flashing across the broken landscape. Reporters arrived soon after, shouting questions into the fog, cameras pointed toward the destruction. I could hear one of them calling my name. The story had finally broken. Literally. And the world was about to find out what happens when you ignore a warning written in the earth itself. The first reporter turns toward Sarah's fence, camera rolling, as news vans swarm the site. The story about to explode across the state. 3 days after the collapse, I thought the worst was over. The rigs were gone, the ridge was fenced off, and the investigation was underway. But greed doesn't die easy. It just changes shape. The courier showed up mid-morning, his uniform spotless against the dust that still clung to everything. He handed me a thick, gold-embossed envelope. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. The letterhead gleamed, Silver Glen Homeowners Association, Legal Counsel. Inside, page after page accused me of everything short of arson, defamation, interference with contractual operations, intentional creation of geological instability. They were suing me for damages. Millions. The same people whose homes had been swallowed by their own arrogance now claimed I was the one who made the earth collapse. For a long minute, I just stood there on the porch, the morning sun warming the paper as I read. Then I laughed, sharp, dry, disbelieving. Of course they would. When you can't control the truth, you attack the one who speaks it. That night my phone rang. It was Dana Holloway. Her voice sounded frayed, half exhaustion, half fury. They filed it this morning, she said. They're trying to control the narrative before the state report goes public. Rick's blaming you in every interview, saying your panic and interference delayed safety reinforcements. I gripped the phone tighter. He's twisting the timeline. They ignored the warnings for weeks. I know, Dana said, but they're muddying the water. People are scared, confused. The HOA still has influence, even now. Not for long, I said quietly. There was a pause. Sarah, you need an attorney. A good one. She was right. The HOA had money and friends in all the wrong places. I couldn't fight this alone. Not anymore. The next morning I met Marianne Ellis in a small office off Main Street. No marble floors or designer suits, just a woman with sharp eyes, rolled up sleeves, and a stack of case files taller than her coffee mug. She listened without interrupting, flipping through the lawsuit, then my binders of data, maps, and letters. When I finished, she leaned back and gave a low whistle. They're desperate. You've got them cornered, and they know it. They're claiming I caused geological instability, I said. That my soil markers and warnings triggered panic leading to negligence. Marianne smirked. That's not how geology or law works. Truth is an absolute defense in defamation cases. If what you said was true and you can prove it, and you can, then their entire claim collapses faster than that ridge. Her confidence steadied me. For weeks I'd felt like the ground could open at any second, figuratively or literally. But here across the table from this no-nonsense attorney, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt resolve. We spent hours building the case. Everett's data, the videos, the timestamps, the county reports, even Connie's earlier threats disguised as cooperation. Every document told the same story. They'd known the risk and drilled anyway. At one point, Marianne looked up from her notes. You realize, once this goes public, it's going to get ugly. They'll drag your name through every headline. I've already buried my father, my peace, and half a ridge to this fight, I said. They can drag what they want. I'm not backing down. Her eyes softened, the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. Then we file a counterclaim. Harassment, retaliation, and reckless endangerment. We make them answer for every notice, every lie, every threat. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and familiar. For the first time in months, it didn't make me flinch. I gathered the papers, feeling their weight, not as a burden, but as a weapon. They want to fight, I said, standing. Then let's take it to court. The camera lingers on Sarah signing the legal documents, her voice steady as rain begins to fall outside. A storm both literal and legal, now coming for the HOA. The courthouse smelled like old paper and nerves. I'd spent years in briefing rooms and command tents, but nothing prepared me for this. The sterile hum of air vents, the scratch of pens, the quiet judgment of strangers who held your future in their hands. When I walked in that morning, the Silver Glen HOA lawyers were already there. 3 of them, dressed in charcoal suits and confidence. They didn't look at me, not directly. They looked through me, the way people look through something they don't believe should still be standing. At the center table, Marianne Ellis sat calm, collected, a stack of color-coded binders at her elbow. You ready? She asked, not looking up. I've been ready for months, I said. The judge entered, a stern woman with silver hair and no patience for theatrics. Let's proceed, she said. And just like that, the war began. The HOA's lead attorney opened first, his voice smooth as polished marble. He painted me as a bitter outsider, a recluse with a vendetta against community progress. He gestured toward me like I was a warning sign. Ms. Brooks's reckless actions, he said, her interference, her public agitation, all of it fueled panic, disrupted our client's operations, and contributed to the instability that caused the collapse. Marianne didn't flinch. She just waited. When he finished, she stood, adjusted her jacket, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "will show that Ms. Brooks's so-called panic was in fact accurate prediction, supported by science, confirmed by experts, and ignored by those who valued profit over safety." She started with the evidence: core samples, photographs, vibration charts, each piece a nail in the HOA's coffin. Everett Toller took the stand next, his gravelly voice filling the room. He laid out the facts with the precision of a surgeon. "This ridge was built on karst," he said, pointing to a geological cross-section on the screen. "That means hollow limestone. The HOA's contractor drilled straight through the ceiling of a void 80 yards wide. These tremor patterns," he tapped the chart, "are the Earth's warning signs. Ms. Brooks recognized them because she's trained in structural integrity. Her data matches mine." One of the HOA lawyers stood. "Dr. Toller, isn't it true this was an unverified survey?" Everett smirked. "Unverified? I verified sinkholes from Kentucky to Kandahar, counselor. The ground doesn't need your approval to collapse." A ripple of laughter ran through the courtroom. Even the judge hid a smile. Next came Liz Marston, the reporter who'd first broken the story. She testified about the viral footage, the video where I'd stood at the fence, warning the HOA to stop. Marianne played the clip on a large screen. My voice echoed through the courtroom. "That ground won't forgive you." The silence afterward was heavy, reverent. Then it was my turn. Taking the stand felt like stepping into open air. My palms were cold, my heart beat loud enough to feel in my throat. Marianne's voice softened as she began. "Ms. Brooks, in your own words, why did you do what you did?" I took a breath. "Because I've seen what happens when people ignore the signs. I wasn't trying to stop progress. I was trying to stop a funeral. I warned them because the land was shifting. I recorded proof because I knew no one would believe me without it. And when they laughed, I kept watching. Because someone had to." The opposing attorney rose, his tone sharp. "So you admit you interfered?" "I admit I refused to stay quiet," I said. "There's a difference." The courtroom murmured. Even the judge's pen paused mid-note. When closing arguments came, Marianne spoke last. She moved slowly, her voice low, but steady. "This case isn't about noise complaints or community rules. It's about accountability. The HOA drilled through unstable limestone, ignored every warning, and destroyed their own homes. They don't want justice, they want silence. But truth doesn't bend to intimidation." The judge disappeared for only 20 minutes. When she returned, her verdict was swift. "This court finds no merit in the plaintiff's claims. The evidence demonstrates clear negligence by the Silver Glen Homeowners Association and its affiliates. The case is dismissed. With prejudice." That phrase, "with prejudice," hit like thunder. Permanent vindication. They couldn't come after me again. Marianne turned, smiling faintly. "You just made legal history in this county." But as the HOA lawyers packed up their briefcases, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, like the ridge itself. Justice, I realized, doesn't heal what's already been broken. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones flashing. Someone shouted my name, but I didn't stop. The sun was setting over the repaired fence line, casting gold over the dust. I looked toward the ridge and whispered, "They finally heard me." Sarah stands alone outside the courthouse, victory papers in hand, the crowd roaring behind her, but her eyes drift toward the horizon, where the land still remembers. The week after the verdict, Silver Glen went quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the stunned quiet that follows a reckoning. The air itself felt heavier, as if the ridge still hadn't finished exhaling. What was left of the HOA board had resigned before the ink on the court order even dried. Their glossy letterhead was gone from every bulletin. Their cheerful neighborhood website deactivated overnight. Rick Granger's resignation hit the local paper first. "Unforeseen circumstances," the statement said. But the photos told the truth. He looked hollowed out, His eyes sunk deep like someone who'd finally heard the Earth's verdict and couldn't live with it. Word was, he'd moved 2 counties over to live with his sister. No one saw him pack. He just vanished between dawn and shame. Connie Miller disappeared too. One neighbor claimed she'd been escorted out of the municipal building by investigators asking about Ridgecore Energy's missing funds. Another said she'd skipped town entirely, leaving her house unlocked and her cat behind. No one confirmed which story was true. Either way, Silver Glen's queen of clipboards was gone. The new interim HOA board, 3 reluctant volunteers and a retired teacher, did what the old one never would. They opened the books. For the first time, the residents saw where their fees had gone. Consulting dinners at Nashville resorts, retreat travel billed to the association, and thousands paid to a private firm that specialized in suppressing online reviews. When those numbers hit the community bulletin, the dam broke. People flooded the next emergency meeting, voices raised not in gossip but in fury. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The neighborhood didn't need me to speak for them anymore. They'd found their own voice. Legally, every homeowner in Tennessee has the right to full financial disclosure from their HOA. It's written in black and white. If you pay into an association, you have a right to see where your money goes. Most people don't know that until it's too late. Now Silver Glen did, and they weren't going to forget it. Within a month, the old charter was dissolved. The new board voted to rewrite every bylaw, line by line, under public supervision. They banned private contracts, mandated geological reviews for future projects, and set aside funds for environmental audits. The community that once worshipped uniformity was now obsessed with transparency. It was messy, it was loud, but it was honest. Some of the same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now showed up at my gate with casseroles, coffee, or awkward words of apology. Mr. Larson, who used to complain about my weathered fence, stood at the edge of the pasture one evening, hat in hand. "We didn't listen," he said quietly. "We just didn't want to believe you were right." I didn't say much. I just nodded. The land itself was still raw. The crater had been fenced off by the state, its edges marked with warning signs and fresh soil barriers. It looked like a wound, but at least it was no longer bleeding. I rode Rusty along the northern field at sunset, the air still carrying the faint scent of limestone and grass. The ridge was quieter now, too quiet. But in that quiet, I felt something shifting again. Not danger this time. Something closer to release. As I reached the top of the hill, I looked down at the scarred land that had started it all. The earth had spoken in violence, but maybe, just maybe, it was ready to heal. I didn't know if peace could grow from ground that had been torn open by greed, but I was willing to try. "Easy now," I whispered to Rusty, watching the horizon fade gold to gray. "Let's see if the land remembers mercy." Sarah gazes over the crater as the wind stirs the dust, a faint green sprout pushing through the cracked soil, proof that even broken ground can breathe again. By the following spring, the pasture began to change. Not because I forced it, but because the land seemed ready to breathe again. The rains came early that year, soft and steady, turning the dirt a darker shade of red and coaxing up wildflowers where only dust had been. The crater at the southern ridge, once a wound of raw limestone and shattered clay, now stood still, silent but alive, its edges lined with tough grass and stubborn weeds. I'd stopped thinking of it as damage. It had become something else. The idea for the sanctuary came almost by accident. A woman named Claire reached out after reading Liz Marston's final article. Her son, an 8-year-old on the autism spectrum, loved horses but couldn't handle noise or crowds. She asked, almost apologetically, if she could bring him to meet Rusty. I said yes. That Saturday, they came just after sunrise. The boy, Eli, didn't speak much. He stood behind his mother at first, eyes wide at the sight of Rusty's dappled coat. Rusty took one look, snorted softly, and walked right up to him. The boy raised a trembling hand, and Rusty lowered his head until their foreheads nearly touched. For a long moment, No one spoke. It was the calmest I'd seen that horse since the night the ridge gave way. When they left, Claire cried quietly in her truck. "He's never been that peaceful," she whispered. Word spread faster than I expected. Veterans, widows, parents with special needs kids, all people looking for quiet, started calling. They didn't want tours or lessons. They just wanted to be near the land, to sit in stillness. I built a shaded area near the barn. A few benches, a water trough, and an open gate that anyone could walk through. No fences, no fees, no rules. Just space and silence. By summer, neighbors who once avoided me started showing up to help. Alan brought lumber to build a small walkway down toward the lower paddock. Mrs. Kavanaugh, the same woman who'd once complained about my faded flag, donated paint and spent afternoons brushing the horses. Even Dana Holloway came by one Saturday with her teenage daughter, helping plant trees along the ridgeline. It wasn't just volunteer work, it was redemption. One afternoon, a group of veterans from a nearby recovery center arrived. They sat by the crater's edge, boots off, feet dangling just above the hardened clay. We didn't talk about what brought us there. We didn't need to. The silence between us was its own kind of therapy. The land had taken so much, but it was giving back in the only way it knew, through peace. Setting up the sanctuary legally took time. I didn't want another organization controlling it, not after what I'd been through with the HOA. So I filed it as a land-based nonprofit under my own name. Still my property, still my responsibility, but open to the public for educational and therapeutic use. Tennessee law allows for that, as long as ownership remains intact. It meant no board, no politics, and no one to misuse it again. The land would answer only to itself. One evening, a young man walked up the hill as I was feeding Rusty. He stopped at the edge of the crater, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the uneven rim. "You ever think about filling it in?" he asked softly. I looked at the crater, the slant of golden light spilling into it, the wildflowers growing where the rigs once stood. "No," I said. "It's part of the story now." He nodded, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the grass like breath, slow, forgiving, alive. Sarah stands by the crater as the sun sinks low, her reflection caught in its shadowed depth. What was once destruction has become purpose, and yet, the story of the land isn't over. A year later, the ridge was quiet again, but not empty. On the anniversary of the collapse, the people of Silver Glen gathered at the edge of the fenced crater, lanterns in their hands and candles flickering against the dusk. There were no speeches, no cameras, no reporters this time, just neighbors, families, and strangers who'd once been divided by fences and fear. They came not to mourn the disaster, but to remember what it taught us. Someone placed a small wooden sign by the gate. It read, "On this ground, arrogance fell, and truth rose." As the lanterns were lit one by one, their glow painted the crater in soft gold. Children who had once been told to stay away from my pasture now sat on the grass beside their parents, whispering questions about the night the earth gave way. No one shushed them, no one turned away. The silence we shared wasn't heavy anymore. It was sacred. I stood beside Everett Toller, both of us older, quieter, our shadows long in the evening light. He'd come back for this, though he hated crowds. "Didn't think I'd ever see an HOA crowd around a sinkhole like it's a church," he said, half smiling. I smiled too. Maybe it is one now. The weeks leading up to that night had brought something I never expected. Justice that reached beyond Silver Glen. Dana Holloway, true to her word, had taken Everett's data and my documentation straight to the state legislature. Together, they drafted a bill requiring full geological surveys before any new residential development could be approved on karst terrain. The governor signed it into law that spring. They named it the Brooks-Toller Act. The papers called it reform. To me, it was a promise that what happened here would never happen again. Not in my county, not in my state. The law made headlines, but the real victory was quieter. People began asking questions before signing HOA contracts. Builders started hiring real geologists instead of consultants. And for the first time in a long time, people listened to the land before trying to own it. When the vigil ended, I stayed behind as everyone drifted home. The night was warm, the stars faint but steady. Rusty stood by the gate, his mane catching the candlelight. I walked to the crater's edge and looked down at the grass growing along its rim. Green, defiant, alive. This place, I whispered. It never stopped talking. We just stopped hearing. The wind answered in a low hum across the ridge, carrying the faint smell of rain and limestone. I thought about my father, about the years I'd spent trying to keep peace with the land, and how it had finally spoken back, not in anger, but in truth. I still walk that ridge every morning. Sometimes I stop at the crater, sometimes I just listen to the breeze through the fence. The ground feels steady again, and that, after everything, is enough. The camera fades on Sarah walking the ridge at sunrise, her figure small against the vast horizon. A quiet reminder to listen to the land before it ever has to scream.